Well, let's get into this news story, the biggest news story of the day. Obviously, this will be one of the biggest news stories of the week. Actually, that sounds a bit flippant as well. I'm not gonna speak to it like that. We're sticking with TVNZ for a good portion of tonight, mostly because that's what I watched tonight, so I saw what they were saying about it. And we're just going to start with a 40-second clip with Simon Dello going through the events and the timeline of what happened today.
Let's take a look at exactly how events unfolded in Auckland CBD this morning. At 7:22, police received multiple emergency calls about a person firing a weapon on the third floor of a building currently under renovation. Officers were on the scene within minutes. 10 minutes later, police entered the building where many people stuck inside were desperately trying to hide from the gunman. At 8 a.m, armed police found the shooter inside a lift shaft where he'd barricaded himself in. The offender fired at police, injuring an officer. Shots were exchanged and the offender was later found dead. Police also discovered the bodies of 2 other people. Just after 1 p.m, cordons around Lower Queen Street were lifted, but a scene guard remains in place.
So that's the timeline, 40 seconds from TVNZ, and then TVNZ will go into the main story covering off what happened today. We'll continue with that.
That deadly shooting has cast a dark shadow just as the eyes of the world focus on New Zealand for the biggest women's sporting event on the planet. Police confirm 3 people are dead, including the gunman, and 10 others injured after the shooter, armed with a pump-action shotgun, stormed a building undergoing renovations in downtown Auckland. The gunman's been identified as 24-year-old Matutangi Reid, who was on home detention for violence offences, including male assaults female. He was wearing an electronic monitoring bracelet, but had an exemption to work at the building site.
This is some conversation that's been going around today, Chewy. We're going to play some footage from Christopher Luxon today. We're going to play some footage from Chippy. And when Chippy talked about this, not all the information had been released. People were confused as to how he could have an electronic monitoring anklet and also get himself into town. And what we found out is he worked on that site and he had an exemption to go to that site, which was his place of work. I don't think it's been confirmed whether he was still working there, but there was an exemption, which means he didn't breach his conditions of having the anklet because he was allowed to go to that site because he was at some stage or currently, we're not sure, working there. So that's why he was able to do it without, like you expect people to say, well, how could he have had be electronically monitored and get into town? Well, he was actually allowed to go there. It was part of the conditions of his, do you call it bail? Whatever the sentence is when it's in there.
Yeah, it's monitoring.
The shooting occurred at this building in the CBD near the bottom of Queen Street by the city's major transport hub. We have extensive coverage this evening. The One News team standing by across the scene and at Eden Park, where the Women's Football World Cup is kicking off in just under an hour. We begin tonight with Barbara Drever, who's been covering the day's dramatic events since this morning.
Armed police storming a downtown construction site in search of a gunman on the loose. On the upper floors, workers hide from the shooter as he roams through the building.
We basically barricaded the door to the office we were sitting in and just started hiding on the desk. We tried to run out. And he was still just standing in the staircase holding what looked like to be a shotgun.
Breakfast was live as rapid shots were fired.
What is happening? We can hear firing, we can hear gunshots coming from the building.
A worker could be seen running for his life. The gunman, who was barricaded in an elevator shaft, opened fire at police who shot back.
We heard shots fired like machine gun. Bam, bam, bam.
We were really scared. Yeah, because you don't know where the bullet's going to come from and where it's going to go.
This police officer was one of 10 people injured, most of them taken to Auckland Hospital. Police found 2 bodies on the lower floors. Shocked survivors were evacuated from the building.
They're all being moved out really quickly. Ambulances are now being allowed to go in.
We were right at the entrance and I saw 20 people rushing out of the building and telling the pedestrians to move. I was like, what happened? And I go ask them, they say we saw a guy with a shotgun in his hand and he was aiming for people.
But it was hours before those taking shelter on the roof would be let down. The gunman was a 24-year-old on home detention for domestic violence-related charges.
However, he had an exemption to work at the site, and so there's no indication at this stage of a breach of those conditions.
The hotel construction site turned from an active situation to a crime scene.
We are very good at chaos.
It's something that we don't like, but we are prepared for.
The world's best footballers shocked as they woke up in hotels surrounding the cordon. The day Auckland wanted to show off its best face to the world, starting with tragedy.
And Barbara's with us now live. Kia ora, Barb. You've just got new details about the gunman?
Yes, that's right. Corrections have confirmed that Matu Tangimatua Reid was on home detention and he checked in with his probation officer just yesterday. Now, under the terms of his conditions, he was allowed to come to work to this hotel construction site behind me. He was an employee of a contractor there. Corrections say that he had completed drug and alcohol programs and he'd also been involved in an anti-violence program. Up until this morning, they say that they considered he'd done everything right, but they'll obviously be conducting a review into what's happened.
We saw in your report, you were there as the shots rang out. Tell us what that was like.
Well, you can imagine it was shocking for everyone outside. You can only imagine what it was like for those inside. And probably the worst thing was seeing the workers that sheltering behind pillars, and they were up against the windows and they had their arms around each other, supporting each other as obviously the active shooter went through that building. When they came out, I did speak to quite a few of those construction workers, most of them migrant workers, and they said they were okay, but you could tell from their faces they were pale, their hands they were shaking, and so you could tell that they're heavily traumatised by that event. Some were taken away by police, obviously witnesses, and their employer says they'll be putting in support measures to help them through this, what has been an extremely traumatic event.
So there's story number one. Chewie, it kind of gives a rundown of what happens. What are your thoughts? I have lots of thoughts. What are yours?
Yeah, look, it was a hell of a thing to wake up. You know, you pick up your phone and that's the lead story, and you're like, oh, Jesus. It's always really tempting to try and put the pieces together with like little to no information. Obviously, the news reporters are trying to do that on the fly as well. That lady's been there all day.
Yeah.
From the sounds of it. She was right there in the morning. Yeah. She's still there. Let her go home. Yeah, I mean, people are like, yeah, as we're saying about the electronic monitoring, how to get hold of a weapon.
I think that's a big. That's one of the biggest questions: is how did he get hold of a weapon? Because I mean, I think that we're all in agreement, maybe not everyone watching or listening or watching this on demand, is that, you know, we have a pretty safe country in general. You know, the exceptions doesn't necessarily represent the rules with our guns, and people are going to get rid of illegal guns. I watched the actual press conference with the police commissioner, and he said that they'd done sweeps of this guy's house. He was monitored. This is not a case of someone who was like slipping through the cracks with a cachet of firearms at his house. You know, everything was done right, and he got the gun off Uncle Bob, stole it from somewhere, off whatever, don't know, went out and bought it illegally the night before. Yeah, so it's, and look, we're not, maybe because we're just a couple of buffhead, we're not journalists. I love it when people talk about us being journalists, and I have to go, we're not journalists. I'm not a journalist, not a trained journalist. It's not my job. I'm not in that area. But I am a trained camera operator from the looks of things. I still want to approach this with an element of seriousness and respectability and professionalism. However, in saying that, as I start to be unprofessional, it would appear pretty obviously it's someone who has had a problem with something or some people at that workplace and has gone back for what he would deem as retribution. You hear about postal workers in America going postal. That's why that term means that when people are in a situation where for whatever reason something's happened and they put themselves out to correct what they think is an injustice. Now, I'm not saying any of that's happened here, but he worked there. He went back there with a gun. He used a firearm at the gun. There's obviously some connection to do. It wasn't a coincidence. With something and someone and some reason he did that to do with the workplace. You can now clean up all my shit, Chewie, while I go clean up my camera.
I mean, I would agree. Look, we're connecting dots here, but it feels like he was either sacked, or it was workplace bullying, and it was a guy that was prone to violence anyway. He's decided to get even with someone, and then as one of you mentioned in the chat, that ends up with suicide by cop because he knows how deep a hole he's dug. I mean, it's so sad. The silver lining, if there is one here, is at least it was just a shotgun and not like a semi-automatic or something of that ilk.
I think when you see the police officer coming holding his eye, that's because he'll have buckshot in his face. Whereas, as you say, if it was an AK or if it was an assault rifle, it would be, I mean, I don't want to be graphic, but it would be a bullet in the head, so it's so hard to try and not even try and find the good side of it. There is no good side, but there are some realities that it could have been so much worse. And look, I what I just said is kind of really inappropriate, and I get that. But I think it will be interesting. How do I say this?
Hard to choose your words.
Yeah, how do you say? Because it's not interesting. It's fucking horrific. But I let me put it this way: I wouldn't be surprised if the deceased people are somehow connected to him. In other words, it's not random. It's not, and I'm not saying that in any kind of obviously in defense of him. But I'm just, these things when they happen overseas are a connection between the shooter and the shootee. Very, very infrequently is there a shooter who kills someone who they're not somewhat connected to. It does happen, random drive-bys, that kind of stuff, but it's far more common for it. And put that on the back of him working there, and it's conjecture. I'll shut up. But no one else will say this because they're professional journalists. We're a couple of drunkards from Dunedin just spitting shit, and I think everyone's thinking, obviously there's a connection, so I'm going to say obviously there's a connection.
I mean, I would imagine, well, the police do their thing now, right? I see that Corrections has opened up an investigation on how he was monitored and how he was checked and that sort of thing. The police will be running down the gun and following his movements, probably talking to Corrections as well.
Yep.
We'll see more details come out in the weeks ahead. But yeah, I mean, it's a natural human reaction to try and sort out a pattern or make a guess at what happened.
Well, let's also have a look at a little bit more about the shooter. His name is Matu Reid. He's 24. This is from One News website. This is about his sentence that he had the bracelet for. Reid was drinking with a female who has name suppression before he became angry. This is 2021. And the two got into an argument. He made verbal threats and kicked her in the stomach, which led to a male assault female charge he would later face. He then put his hands around her throat for 10 seconds, leading to strangulation charge. Reid went on to repeatedly slap and punch the woman, pushing the handle of a pair of scissors into her torso and swinging a bottle of wine at her, which missed. The woman then left to get police, and Reid burned items in her room while she was gone, leading to a willful damage charge. For his crimes, Reid was sentenced to 5 months home detention on March 28, 2023. Some conditions of home detention were as follows: not to have any alcohol or drugs, to attend an appropriate non-violence program, to complete an alcohol and drug program, not to associate with the victim. The victim forgave Reid for his offending and stated he had been doing well recently as he was working. Prior to this sentencing, Reid had one other conviction for common assault dated from 2020-2021. Reid's probation officer commented that his risk of reoffending was low, but his risk of causing harm to other people because of the violent nature of his offending was high. The probation officer recommended home detention, which Reid eventually was sentenced to. I mean, again, this is, what's going to happen with ACT tomorrow, or the next day, or the next day. They're going to just use this as a way to say how pathetic home detention is and everyone should be locked up. Because if he was locked up inside, this wouldn't have happened. I mean, it's for this individual isolated case, probably hard to argue that. But as we always say here, anecdotal evidence doesn't necessarily represent what the data would say. But this is where this is going to go. We're going to have a look shortly at what National had to say today. And they tried so hard not to politic off the back of this. And they got so close to not politicking off the back of this. Whilst they were saying we're not going to politic off this, they got so close to not doing it until they politicked off the back of this. We'll get to that shortly. But Chewy, anything else, mate?
No, you've covered everything.
All right, so let's have a look. This is Mark Mitchell and their hairless leader talking to the press today about not doing. I mean, look, Christopher Luxon's saying all the right things, right? Like, if he had have actually done what he says in the first 2 minutes, I'd be applauding him tonight. Yeah. But they got so close. And I don't want to use this as a way to shit on National tonight. I don't. But they got so close to going, we're not going to do politics today, until they slipped into doing politics. So I actually kind of disagree. Actually, let's not do this first, Joey. I actually think today is a day for doing politics. Because when it's the other way, when it's a, let's say, right-wing shooter in America who shoots up a school, yeah, and it's the right-wing politicians who go, this is not the time. It's like, that's actually exactly the time. So I actually disagree with we shouldn't be talking about this today. I think they should be talking about this today. However, what annoys me is them saying, we're not going to talk about this today. We're not going to politic today, and then politicking. So I don't actually have a problem with them politicking. Right? I have a problem with them saying, yes, we're going to take the moral high ground and not politic, and then slip in some politicking. That's what I have trouble with, Chewy. So let's see what they had to say. I've got a clip that's about 2 minutes, and I've got two 30-second clips as well.
Morning and aren't going home tonight. And I want to express on behalf of the National Party our condolences to those families that have actually lost loved ones. I want to also wish a speedy recovery to those that have been injured. And importantly, also acknowledge those that will have been traumatised by the events that transpired not that far away from here this morning. What we saw from our police and first responders was some incredibly heroic activity. And I think when all the events of today are...
Look, I think if he'd stopped talking after 3 minutes, all of us would be applauding him. In fact, most people probably are. Maybe I'm being a bit picky. Maybe. We'll see.
Together, more and more heroes will...
I think as soon as Mark Mitchell leans in, I started to go, here we go. That's what I thought. But then even his start of his statement, I was like, oh yeah, that's okay. And they just couldn't quite stick that landing.
Emerge from what happened here this morning. I want to acknowledge behind every police officer is our family, as a partner, as parents, our kids. And they will have been watching those events unfold this morning, hoping and praying that their person was safe. And I also want to acknowledge the others that were looking at that site, hoping that their person was also safe as a worker on that site. There are lots of questions that New Zealanders will have, but today is not that day. Today is not a day for politics. It is really a day to remember and to express tremendous gratitude to our police officers, to our ambulance officers.
It's like people who wish that Oscar winners would go, thank you for the win, and walk off stage, exit stage left. This should have been exit stage left. And look, I actually am being a bit harsh, because it's not heavy politicking, but it's not quite sticking the landing.
To our hospital staff and members of the public who stepped up and offered help when it was most needed by so many. So we want to thank them for all of their efforts, and we also want to acknowledge that is New Zealand at its best in a really tough situation. With that, Mark and I are happy to take any questions you may have. Look, again, I mean, we've got a comprehensive set of law and order policies that Mark and I have talked a lot about this issue in the past year and a half. Again, I don't really want to get into that today. There will be a day for us to talk about politics and what happened here and why it happened.
It's okay.
But that's not today.
Again,
you know, our position on this is well expressed and been well understood. But again, I'm not going to get into that. Today. We can talk about it tomorrow.
Can I just say that I think Chris has captured it very well. But I don't want anyone to underestimate just how difficult the situation was for the police to deal with. It's almost the worst scenario that they could have put in front of them. You had a very big building with multiple floors. You had an active shooter. They had to recover people that had already been shot and injured. They were conscious of the fact that there was people in there that could have been taken hostage, and there were shots being fired as they arrived on scene. And I want to acknowledge our frontline staff, the ones that put the cordons up.
Can I just say this? And this is not criticism. Genuinely, it's not. This is more observation. The National Party here is focusing quite heavily on, thanking the police, which is appropriate. In the press conference with Chippy, the first people he thanked was the ambulance staff. I'm not criticising. I'm just saying it was interesting observation that the National Party went straight to thanking the police, which is appropriate. That was their number one. And the Labour Party went to thanking the ambulance drivers, which was their number one. Both are appropriate. I just thought it was an interesting observation as to where they went first with their thanks. I'm not saying one should be thanked more than the other. Make that clear. It was just an interesting observation.
and kept the public safe. I want to acknowledge our AOS and our STG members. They were fearless and they went about their job in a professional way, and they showed that they're a world-class police service that actively went in there to locate this offender and make sure that no one else was hurt or killed. And I've got no doubt in my mind that they saved lives in their actions today. And so we want to acknowledge them. We want to acknowledge the ambulance officers that responded, our victim support. We spoke to victim support. They set up immediately down at the Cloud and have also had support up at the hospital. Our 2 police officers that were injured, one of them critically, our thoughts are with their families and with the entire Blue family. And of course the 2 guys that turned up to work, like Chris said, thinking that they were going to just put in a good day's work and get home safely to their families, and they're not. And their families aren't going to see them walking through that front door again. And so our thoughts go out to there. Do we want to hold the government to account on this? Yes, but that is for another day. Today it is about acknowledging our police officers, our first responders, and the families that have suffered a terrible tragedy today.
So
I'm not sure if I'm mishearing that or not.
That sticking of the landing that I was talking about at the end of Mark, and this is where I was going to stop it anyway, at the end of the Mark Mitchell speech, blaming the government. Like, they're like, don't get this wrong. Do we want to hold the government accountable for this? Is saying the government is accountable for this. They got so fucking close. They got so close to sticking the landing. Like, even a little bit of that with Luxon going, we have comprehended. That was actually okay, right? They got so close, and then Mark Mitchell blamed the government.
Again. And so our thoughts go out to there. Do we want to hold the government to account on this? Yes, but that is for another day. Today it is about acknowledging our police officers, our first responders, and the families that have suffered a terrible tragedy today.
If it's not the government's fault, according to National, why would they hold them to account?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I'd heard him correctly. It almost sounded like we want to hold the gunman to account.
Government.
Just the way he mumbled that bit, and I'm like, well, how are you going to do that? Dude's dead.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. Like, I'm going to give some credit to Luxon here. That was probably the most humanistic string of words that I've heard him say in a long time. He didn't seem to be very rehearsed.
Yep.
It seemed genuine. Small criticism. Probably wouldn't have even bothered taking any questions from reporters. They weren't going to add anything to what you just said.
Well, because you know what the reporters are going to do. They're going to look for their headline. They're going to go, now, Mr. Luxon, how much does Labor suck? That's obviously. So, yeah, maybe hindsight 2020, he shouldn't have. Maybe he didn't think it in the moment. Still give him credit. I agree with you. I think his original 3 minutes or 2 minutes, whatever it was spot on, was perfect. But I'm going to play you 2 more 30-second clips, and the longer they stand in front, the more I said they didn't stick the landing, the wobblier and wobblier that landing gets. About not speaking about it today.
I'm not surprised at all.
I'll do those now then, eh? So here's a little 30-second clip. Remember what I've said? They're not politicking, right? They're not politicking. But that landing, it's harder and harder.
Well, look, we've been really clear about our policy. We've got a comprehensive set of policies that Mark and I have unveiled over the course of the last year and a half now. It's really about backing our police, tackling gangs, serious consequences, and also ensuring that we have stronger sentencing. So, again, I'm not going to go into the detail of all of
I'm not going to go into the detail. I'll just list off all our policies because we're not politicking.
I honestly think it's disrespectful for us to do so today. We can do that tomorrow and in the coming days.
So there's that one, and I'll play one more little one. Remember, they're not politicking, and they want to make sure that everyone knows they're not politicking. This one is about 45 seconds.
Well, look, we've been talking about the rising levels of crime and how people are not feeling safe in their own homes, their own businesses, and their own communities now for a year and a half. There is no doubt about it when we talk to New Zealanders up and down this country. That is the reality of how they feel, and quite rightfully so. We have seen crime get out of control.
But they're not politicking, Chewy. Today's not a day for politicking.
We've seen violent crime get out of control. So again, I'm not going to go into the details of policy and what's the right prescription, but we've had a comprehensive set of policies actually to think about actually how we reduce crime now for some time.
So it's actually not that different from every other day. We can solve this problem. We've got policies. We're not going to tell you what those are. That's actually no different from the past 12 months of policy announcement from National in general.
So it is important that we actually, as I keep saying, pay huge respect to the police officers that were involved, paid huge respect to the families that have lost their loved ones today, but we will talk about this in the coming days, I'm sure. We all have lots of questions about what and why and what transpired here, but unfortunately, that is not the day today.
Right. So, like I said, they got so close. And then the longer I think it was only 9 minutes, 10-minute press conference went on, the further away they got from sticking that landing. I've got a couple of other things I want to show, including Chippy's comments. But I've watched that and set it up, Chewy. So why don't you have a go at it? Seeing that's the first time you've seen my clips.
Yeah, like 90%, great. And then thank everybody, and then leave. And that's exactly what Arrest JK said. The correct response when the cameras turned up would have been, "Our hearts go out to the victims. Thanks to the police, etc., etc. No comment for today. Goodbye." Like in and out.
Yeah,
and we wouldn't have anything to say about it. We probably would have given them more props than anything. And then as you said, the longer it went on, the more they fell back into the old routines. It's like, yeah, we don't want to politicize this, but of course, I'm going to make reference to all the politicking I've done. Today's not a day for politics, though. But here's a little sneak preview of the politicking that we'll be doing about this in the future. Stay tuned. Yeah. It's crass. It's bullshit. They're not good at it. And I think this has been my overriding thing. We're going to obviously look at Chris Hipkins' response as well. But this is one of the things that I want people to hold in their mind when they're talking to people that say it doesn't matter who I vote for. Because, hey, 90% of the time, maybe it doesn't. But then in a moment of crisis, your leader is important. We saw that with Jacinda 3 times. Yeah. We've seen it with Chris Hipkins a little bit. With the cyclone and now this. What would a Chris Luxon crisis response be like?
Yeah. Yeah, and look, I'll say it again. I'll be really clear so as to not be too critical. It's like, I don't agree that today is not the day for politicking. I actually don't. Like I said, if it's in America and it's a conservative Republican going after a mass shooting from a right-wing, extremist, now's not the time to talk about it. Actually, yes, it is. What I have a problem with, and I'll make it clear again, is people saying we're not going to politic off the backs of this. We're not going to score points off the back of this and then scoring points. That's where my problem lies. Yeah. Right, let's have a look at Chippy. Now, Chippy's a little bit more sterile in this. Chippy had this press conference, I think, at like 9:30 this morning, so they didn't have all the information. There's not a heck of a lot that he goes into here other than the facts and the figures, but there is one bit that I want to play for you because, of course, when these sorts of things happen around the world, the first question is ideological or not. Like, is this an extremist? Is this a religious-based fundamentalist? Is this a political ideological fundamentalist? What is it? And this is just a very quick exchange. He said, I think he's talking to Jess Much here from TVNZ about there's no ideological situation here, which again lends this us talking out our asses because we don't know about this being a personalised attack. There was no extra threat. Like Auckland opened back up quite quickly. There was no other places or no other people of interest after they figured out what had happened in some level. So let's have a look at what he had to say. The question is about, what do we know? And he goes into a very quick statement about it not being ideological.
Diplomatic level, Prime Minister, have you made any phone calls this morning, or have you left that to the High Commissioner level to liaise and reassure with some of the countries that have got teams here?
Yeah, the whole New Zealand diplomatic apparatus will obviously be sharing information as we can confirm it, including they will immediately be sharing with others around the world the fact that we haven't identified a national security, an ideological or a political motivation here.
What is the AOS? I know that there's been debate about the location of that specialist service. Given that it was in the CBD, obviously they were able to get there quicker. Does this make you and perhaps the police minister rethink some of the allocation of those resources
I think it's just too early to even speculate on those sorts of things. Joe?
So, very quick, that's all we're going to get from Chippy, but I thought we'd actually also show you one other politician who responded today. Chloe Swarbrick is obviously the MP for Central Auckland, and she was live tweeting what was going on. So her Chloe shared via Twitter. So pretty much, so this says 13 hours ago, but it's been up for, so this was probably as it happened. If you're downtown Auckland Centre, please stay indoors as emergency services respond to an unfolding situation. We're in communication with the front line and will update as necessary and appropriate. It goes on to say, police have contained the situation in downtown Auckland City Centre. Here is their statement. Violence like this has no place in our city nor our country. We utterly reject it and are dedicated to ongoing work on evidence-based interventions to prevent it from ever happening again, which I fully expect will be openly and thoroughly discussed and debated in due course. There will be a time after grieving and reckoning with the senseless violence to address policies and politics. Deep condolences. So there you go. So there was, and I'm sure all the other politicians had some response to it on some level, but that was the MP in that area and the two leaders of our biggest parties. I thought that's probably enough for us to cover off on tonight, Tilly.
Yep. No, absolutely.
Anything in the chat? I'm going to play something else. I'm going to play, one of the things I didn't play for you off TVNZ News was a tourist in New Zealand from, I think, Argentina, saying, this is the first time I've ever seen this kind of thing. This kind of thing doesn't happen in my city. Like the kind of thing we say about when it happens in America, a tourist was saying that about being in New Zealand. And it was kind of like, whoa, that's interesting perspective to hear from someone else. Like this kind of thing happens in New Zealand. It obviously has happened, but again, it's not part of our national narrative. I'm going to play you something shortly to do with America and when this thing happens in America, how they respond to it, just to have a look at a place that this thing does kind of happen, and it's to do with sports as well, which I'll get into, seeing this is all surrounding the FIFA Women's World Cup as well. But do we want to have a look? Is there anything in the chats that we want to get to before I go into that next stage?
Just one comment. Pretending to be human has a 3-minute limit for national MPs. I think that's just been proved. Write that down in the book of knowing. Yes, I think that's all I got started there so far.
So I'm going to show you this. This may not have much to do with anything we're kind of talking about, to be honest, but I think it's interesting to see how only because it's the Women's World Cup, I thought to myself, this is a sporting event, right? And there's the shooting happening around a sporting event. I think this was 12 months ago, Uvalde shooting. Maybe it was more than that, 18 months ago. When the Uvalde shooting, the school shooting happened in America, there was the NBA Finals was on, I believe, at the time. Mm-hmm. Steve Kerr, a former teammate of Michael Jordan, now he's the coach of the Golden State Warriors. He came out and talked to the press after the shooting happened. There's no education here. I'm not trying to compare this to anything that happened in New Zealand. It just reminded me of this, and I wanted to play it for you in a country and from a sporting figure where this does happen regularly. So this is Steve Kerr talking to the press after the Uvalde shooting.
I'm not going to talk about basketball. Nothing's happened with our team in the last 6 hours. We're going to start the same way tonight. Any basketball questions don't matter. Since we left shoot-around, 14 children were killed 400 miles from here, and a teacher. And in the last 10 days, we've had elderly black people killed in a supermarket in Buffalo. We've had Asian churchgoers killed in Southern California, and now we have children murdered at school. When are we going to do something? I'm tired. I'm so tired of getting up here and offering condolences to the devastated families that are out there. I'm so tired of I'm tired of the moments of silence. Enough. There's 50 senators right now who refuse to vote on H.R. 8, which is a background check rule that the House passed a couple of years ago. It's been sitting there for 2 years. And there's a reason they won't vote on it, to hold on to power. So I ask you, Mitch McConnell, I ask all of you senators who refuse to do anything about the violence and school shootings and supermarket shootings, I ask you, are you going to put your own desire for power ahead of the lives of our children and our elderly and our churchgoers, because that's what it looks like. It's what we do every week. So I'm fed up. I've had enough. We're going to play the game tonight, but I want every person here, every person listening to this, to think about your own child or grandchild or mother or father or sister, brother. How would you feel if this happened to you today? We can't get numb to this. We can't sit here and just read about it and go, well, let's have a moment of silence. Yeah, go Dubs, you know. Come on, Mavs, let's go. That's what we're going to do. We're going to go play a basketball game. And 50 senators in Washington are going to hold us hostage. Do you realize that 90% of Americans, regardless of political party, want background check, universal background check? 90% of us, we are being held hostage by 50 senators in Washington who refuse to even put it to a vote, despite what we, the American people, want. They won't vote on it because they want to hold on to their own power. It's pathetic. I've had enough.
So, there would be an example, obviously, an extreme example of American-style response to, gosh, you can't say much more serious shooting. You know, I'm not leveling these things out, but the American culture when it comes to this kind of thing.
Now, I remember with it, you know, that speech obviously made the news at that stage, and everyone went, how raw, how powerful, how unscripted. And then the news cycle moved on. Nothing changed.
You mean this? Oh, you're going to do the same thing.
They've had more than one mass shooting in the US every day so far this year. And I mean, we can't...
And this one, powerful stuff and nothing happens.
Yeah. And I mean, there's no way that we can compare what we're talking about here to what happens over in the States. But in some degree, their conversation will always bleed over into the New Zealand conversation about guns and gun control. And I want to start a timer basically now. I think ACT are going to do one of two things. Or maybe they'll do both. They will go hard on the fact, as you said, that the guy shouldn't have been home detention. That's the big scandal here. Labor soft on crime.
Yep.
And they want to do that to draw attention away from the thing that they don't want to happen. They don't want a gun register.
Yeah.
That's consistently the thing that they've pushed against. And this is the perfect example of why we need one, because it would answer that question, where did he get the gun from? And then the person that gave him the gun, there's consequences for him. One of the things that Christopher Luxon likes. So, you know, I think that gun register is an enormously important part of the puzzle. And I just take note of how people bring that up over the coming days.